In the spring of 1945, a city died, not metaphorically, not in the sense of political defeat or cultural suppression or the end of an era, though all of those things happened too. Literally, building by building, street by street, district by district, a city that had been home to 4 million people was methodically destroyed by the largest concentration of artillery in the history of warfare. Then fought over at close range by nearly 3 million soldiers, and then left in a state of physical devastation that made significant portions of it uninhabitable for years. Berlin in May 1945 was not a defeated city, it was a destroyed one. The distinction matters. Defeated cities can resume their previous functions relatively quickly once the fighting stops. Destroyed cities cannot. They require years of rubble clearance before construction can begin, years of construction before habitation can resume, and years of habitation before the specific urban texture of a functioning city, its shops and the services and the informal networks and the accumulated social knowledge, can reconstitute itself from the fragments that the destruction has left behind. Berlin was rebuilt. It took decades. The specific scar of the city's wartime destruction is still visible in the architecture of the German capital, in the post-war building styles that replaced the 19th century fabric that the battle destroyed, in the gaps in the urban grain that the rebuilding never fully filled, and in the specific geographical division of the post-war city into East and the West. A division whose line was drawn by the positions of Soviet and the Western forces at the battle's end and that persisted for 45 years after the battle that produced it. The Battle of Berlin lasted from April 16 di Mei 2 ND ke 1945, 16 days. By any measure it was one of the most intense urban battles in history. A concentrated application of violence to a specific geographical space that produced casualties at a rate that makes the individual human cost almost impossible to process. Approximately 80,000 Soviet soldiers died in the battle. The German military and the Volkssturm casualties are less precisely documented but are estimated in similar ranges. The civilian casualties in Berlin during the final weeks of the city's defense number in the tens of thousands, killed by artillery, by air attack, by the specific violence of street fighting conducted in inhabited spaces, and by the specific additional violence that Soviet soldiers inflicted on the German civilian population in the context of a campaign in which the distinction between combatant and non-combatant had been systematically destroyed by the nature of the defense the German military had chosen to organize. This is the story of those 16 days, and the story of what produced them. To understand the Battle of Berlin, you have to understand the strategic situation of Germany in the first months of 1945 and the specific decision-making, or the specific failure of decision-making, that brought the war to its end in the ruins of the German capital, rather than in a negotiated surrender that might have ended the fighting weeks or months earlier at significantly less cost to everyone involved. Germany in January 1945 was a country that had already lost the war in every material and strategic dimension. The Ardennes Offensive, the last German strategic reserve committed in the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, had failed to achieve any of its objectives and had been pushed back by American forces at a cost in irreplaceable men, and the equipment that stripped the Western Front of any capacity for further offensive action. In the East, the Soviet Winter Offensive launched on January 12, 1945 had driven German forces back from Warsaw and from the Vistula River line to the Oder River, placing Soviet forces approximately 60 kilometers from Berlin by the beginning of February. The German military in early 1945 was not a force that had conquered Europe between 1939 and 1941. Its most experienced formations had been destroyed or depleted in 4 years of continuous fighting on multiple fronts. Its officer corps, whose professional quality had been the Wehrmacht's most decisive advantage in the early years of the war, had been thinned by casualties and by the deliberate erosion of professional military authority that Hitler's progressive assumption of direct operational command had produced. The formations that would defend Berlin in April tahun 1945 included regular army units, Volkssturm units composed of elderly men and boys who had been drafted into emergency militia service, and Hitler used detachments whose members were in some cases literally children being sent to fight Soviet soldiers in the rubble of the capital. Hitler's decision to remain in Berlin and to direct the final defense of the Reich from the F-Herr bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden is one of the most analyzed command decisions of the entire war. Its military logic was essentially non-existent by the time it was made. Berlin could not be held against the forces approaching it. The forces available for its defense were inadequate. The supply situation was catastrophic. The command structure was dysfunctional. And the political framework within which military decisions were made had deteriorated to the point where officers who gave Hitler accurate assessments of the military situation were stressed for defeatism. The decision to hold Berlin had no more rational military basis in April tahun 1945. It had a specific psychological and ideological basis that is necessary to understand if the final weeks are to be comprehensible. Hitler's worldview, which had been consistent in its essential structure since the 1920s, did not accommodate the concept of managed defeat. It did not provide a framework for negotiated outcomes or graceful retreats from positions that could not be held. Its internal logic was binary in a way that made the final defense of Berlin not merely acceptable but obligatory. Germany would win or Germany would be destroyed. There was no more third option, and the specific destruction of Germany that the final defense of Berlin represented was, in the logic of the ideology that had produced the war, preferable to any outcome that acknowledged defeat while preserving anything of the Germany that had failed to win. The forces arrayed against Berlin in April tahun 1945 represented the greatest concentration of Soviet military power assembled in a single operation during the entire war. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, with over 900,000 men, approached from the east. Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front, with over 500,000 men, approached from the south. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front covered the northern approaches and prevented any relief from the direction. The total Soviet force committed to the Berlin operation exceeded 2.5 million men, supported by over 6,000 tanks, over 40,000 artillery pieces, and over 7,000 aircraft. The competition between Zhukov and Konev for the prestige of capturing Berlin was a personal and institutional rivalry that had Stalin's deliberate encouragement and that had significant operational consequences for the way the battle was fought. Stalin had drawn the interfront boundary in a way that gave Konev the possibility of turning his forces north toward Berlin if Zhukov's advance was slow enough to allow it, creating a race between the two marshals that both understood was what Stalin intended. This rivalry produced an intensity of effort and a willingness to accept casualties. To maintain the pace of advance that a more measured approach would not have generated, and it contributed directly to the decision to use massive artillery bombardment in Berlin's urban areas without the discrimination that concern for minimizing Soviet casualties might otherwise have imposed. The Silo Heights, the defensive ridgeline approximately 50 kilometers east of Berlin on the direct approach route of Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, were the last significant defensible terrain between the Oder River and Berlin itself. The German Ninth Army, commanded by General Theodor Buss, had organized the Seelow Heights into a defensive position of considerable strength given the limitations of the forces available. With carefully positioned artillery, anti-tank positions, and the infantry defenses taking full advantage of the natural terrain of the ridge, Zhukov's assault on the Seelow Heights on April 16, 1945, the opening of the Berlin operation, did not go as planned. Zhukov had decided to conduct the assault under the illumination of searchlights, a tactical innovation designed to blind the German defenders. The searchlights instead illuminated the Soviet attacking forces and disoriented the tank crews, whose vision through the periscopes was degraded rather than improved by the flood of light. The initial assault was repulsed with significant casualties. Zhukov, under extreme pressure from Stalin, who was receiving reports from Konev's advancing forces and making his rivalry with Zhukov explicit, threw more forces at the heights rather than adapting his approach. The Seelow Heights were taken by April 19, but the cost in men and the loss of time relative to Konev's faster advance had consequences both for the timeline of the Berlin battle and for the personnel standing of the two marshals. The encirclement of Berlin was completed on April 25, when units of Zhukov's front and Konev's front met at Ketzin, west of the city, sealing the German garrison inside. On the same day, American and the Soviet forces met at Torgau on the Elbe River, the physical link-up of the two allied advances that symbolically cut Germany in two, and ended any theoretical possibility of a coherent German military response to the Berlin encirclement. Inside the encirclement, the defense of Berlin was organized around a system of 8 defensive rings, each composed of the rubble and the ruins of the city itself converted into fighting positions. The inner defense of Berlin, the Zitadelle, the central government district where the Reich Chancellery and the Bunker were located, was the core of the defense in both practical and symbolic terms. The men defending it included elements of the SS Leibstandarte and the other Waffen-SS formations, regular Wehrmacht units, and the Volkssturm, whose members' motivation for the defense of rubble in a lost war varied considerably between fanatical ideological commitment and the specific terror of men who had been taught that surrendering to Soviet forces was not a survivable option. The Soviet artillery bombardment of Berlin during the final days of the battle was something that no more previous urban bombardment in the history of warfare had matched for intensity. The density of artillery pieces per kilometer of front exceeded any comparable figure from any previous operation of the war. The shelling was so continuous and so heavy that it was described by participants on both sides as physically disorienting. The specific physiological effect of sustained close artillery fire making it difficult to think clearly, to communicate, to process sensory information normally. The city's surface, already devastated by years of Allied air bombing, was progressively reduced by the artillery to a landscape of rubble that had no more parallel outside the specific geography of the Stalingrad battle. In the rubble, the infantry fighting was conducted at the scale of Stalingrad, building by building, floor by floor, room by room. The Soviet tactical doctrine for urban warfare had been developed and refined at Stalingrad and at every subsequent urban battle of the Eastern Front campaign, and the specific assault-engineered units that spearheaded the Berlin fighting, the Sturmtruppen, were equipped and trained for precisely this kind of close-range fighting. Flamethrowers, explosive charges, submachine guns, and the grenades were the primary weapons of the Berlin street fighting, the weapons whose effective range was measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. and whose use required closing with the enemy at distances that made survival a function of millisecond reaction times rather than tactical positioning. The Reichstag building, the German parliament that had been burned in 1933 into the arson that the Nazis used to justify their emergency powers, became the symbolic primary objective of the Soviet assault forces. Its capture, specifically the raising of the Soviet red flag on its roof, was the visual objective that Soviet political and military leadership had designated as the moment of final symbolic victory. The fighting for the Reichstag on April 30, 1945 was among the most intense of the entire battle. The German defenders inside the building holding floors and the rooms against Soviet forces that were simultaneously attacking from multiple directions. The building's massive stone construction providing the specific defensive advantage that heavy construction offers against infantry assault. The photograph of Soviet soldiers raising the red flag on the Reichstag roof, taken by Yevgeny Khaldei on May 2, 1945, is one of the most famous photographs of the entire war and one of the most studied in the history of war photography. The photograph was staged in the sense that Khaldei arranged the composition after the initial flag raising and that the original raising had occurred in darkness during the actual fighting. The photograph was also manipulated after the fact. The rings on the wrist of one of the soldiers removed because they suggested looting, a practice that Soviet censors preferred not to document. These facts are well established and they do not diminish the image's historical significance. What matters is that the flag was set on that roof on the day, and that the building's capture represented the real end of organized resistance in the city's center. Hitler died on April 30, 1945, in the F-Harrer bunker below the Reich Chancellery Garden, by his own hand and by the hand of Eva Braun, who died alongside him on the same day that Soviet forces reached the Reichstag. The manner of his death, a self-inflicted gunshot to the right temple while simultaneously beating on a cyanide capsule, the immediate incineration of the bodies in the Reich Chancellery Garden in accordance with his instruction, has been documented by the testimony of the bunker staff who were present and by the subsequent forensic investigation conducted by Soviet forces. The news of Hitler's death was announced by Goebbels and Bormann on May 2 Street in a radio broadcast that described his death in battle defending Berlin. The specific lie about the manner of dying chosen because suicide was considered dishonoring in the Germanic military tradition that the regime had appropriated and propagandized. Goebbels and his wife Magda then killed their 6 children with cyanide and died themselves in the Reich Chancellery Garden, completing the specific tableau of a regime that had no more mechanism for existing after the death of the man who had been its entire organizing principle. The political aftermath of Hitler's death was managed by Reichspräsident Karl Dönitz, who had been named Hitler's successor in his political testament, and who formed a government at Flensburg near the Danish border with the specific purpose of negotiating surrender in a way that allowed the maximum possible number of German soldiers and civilians to reach Western Allied lines rather than Soviet captivity. This was not a morally neutral objective. It was a calculation based on the specific and accurate assessment that Soviet captivity for German soldiers and the Soviet occupation for German civilians carried costs that Western Allied treatment did not, a calculation that reflected both the genuine brutality of Soviet forces in occupied German territory and the specific consequence of what German forces had done in the Soviet Union during 4 years of occupation. The German military surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. V-Day, the formal ceremony conducted at Reims and then repeated in Berlin at Soviet insistence because the Soviets considered the Reims ceremony, conducted primarily in the presence of Western Allied officers, insufficiently representative of the Soviet contribution to the German defeat. The Berlin ceremony, in which Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the formal surrender in the presence of Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, was the ceremony that Soviet historiography subsequently treated as the definitive surrender moment, a historiographical position that reflects the genuine disproportion between Soviet and the Western casualties in the war's defeat of Germany. The Berlin that Soviet forces occupied in May 1945 was a city of ruins inhabited by a civilian population in conditions of acute crisis. Food was scarce. Water infrastructure was destroyed or damaged. Healthcare had effectively ceased to function. Hundreds of thousands of displaced persons, concentration camp survivors, forced laborers, refugees from the East, and the surviving German civilians were all sharing a physical space that the battle had stripped of most of its capacity to support human life at the basic level. The specific violence against German civilians, and particularly against German women, by Soviet soldiers during and after the battle is one of the most documented and the most difficult aspects of the Berlin occupation. The scale of sexual violence committed by Soviet forces in Berlin and throughout the German territory they occupied is documented in medical records, survivor testimony, and the Soviet military records that have become partially available since the Soviet Union's collapse. Estimates range from tens of thousands to over 100,000 women in Berlin alone. The imprecision of the estimates reflecting the specific conditions under which the violence occurred and the specific barriers to documentation and the reporting that those conditions created. The violence was not a surprise to the Soviet military command in the sense of being unforeseeable. It was a predictable consequence of specific institutional failures in the areas of military discipline, political commissar oversight, and the specific psychological condition of soldiers who had spent 4 years fighting in the conditions of the Eastern Front. While reading political material that characterized the German population collectively as guilty of the crimes that German forces had committed on Soviet territory, the command response to the violence, when it came, was driven partly by genuine concern about the political and the diplomatic consequences of documented atrocities in a territory that the Soviet Union intended to occupy and administer, and partly by concerns about the spread of venereal disease to the Red Army. The moral response, the acknowledgement of the humanity of the victims and the institutional responsibility for the conditions that produced the violence, came much later and remains incomplete. The post-war division of Berlin into 4 occupation zones, American, British, French, and the Soviet, created the specific geography of the Cold War's most famous and the most contested city. The Soviet blockade of West Berlin in 1948 and the Allied airlift that broke it. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 and its fall in 1989. All of these subsequent events were shaped by and in many cases determined by the specific positions that Allied forces had reached in the fighting of April and May 1945. The line of division that was drawn by the battle's outcome was not a temporary administrative boundary. It was the line that defined European politics for 45 years. The Führerbunker, the physical space where the final decisions of the Third Reich were made and where Hitler died, was partially demolished by Soviet forces after the war and further demolished during the construction of the Berlin Wall's reinforced infrastructure. Its underground structure was sealed and built over. Today, an information board in a parking lot near the Wilhelmstrasse marks the location. Series Nomor Memorial. Series Nomor Preserved Site. The German decision to mark rather than commemorate the location reflects a specific cultural and political judgment about what forms of memorial serve the purposes of historical memory and which ones risk serving other purposes instead. Above the parking lot, the city continues. The Reichstag has been rebuilt and is now the home of the German parliament. Its glass dome designed by Norman Foster allowing natural light into the chamber in a transparency that the building's history makes simultaneously architectural and symbolic. The Brandenburg Gate stands as it stood in 1945, though its columns are pockmarked by bullet impacts that restoration has deliberately preserved rather than repaired. The physical evidence of the battle retained in the monument as a form of testimony that stone can provide. The 80,000 Soviet soldiers who died in the Battle of Berlin are in cemeteries across the eastern part of the city and in the Soviet War Memorial at Treptower Park, whose scale and the aesthetic vocabulary of socialist heroic monumentalism expresses the Soviet understanding of the battle's significance in the specific language of a political culture that no longer exists in the form that built it. German visitors walk through it now in a country that has changed in ways that the soldiers buried beneath it could not have imagined and that the regime they defeated could not have survived to prevent. The last 16 days of Nazi Germany cost approximately the same number of lives as the entire Battle of Britain. They happened in the ruins of a city that had taken a century to build and that was destroyed in the specific efficiency of modern warfare in approximately 16 days. They ended a regime that had started them, that had created the conditions of its own annihilation in the specific way that totalitarian systems rooted in absolute and unverifiable claims about the nature of reality tend to create those conditions, by refusing to acknowledge the discrepancy between the reality they claim and the reality that exists until the discrepancy becomes violent enough to be undeniable. The violence in April and May 1945 was undeniable. The rubble was real. The dead were real. And the city that emerged from the rubble, slowly, imperfectly, divided for 45 years and then gradually and incompletely reunified, is the specific consequence of 16 days in which the gap between what the Third Reich claimed to be and what it actually was closed, finally and permanently, by 3 million soldiers and the specific weight of historical reality pressing down on a bunker beneath a burning city. The city lives. The regime that burned it does not. That asymmetry is the only monument that history reliably produces, and yet is the only one that matters.